Welcome to RayPresents. My guest today is Interim Chief Commissioner Charlotte Ann Malischewski of the Canadian Human Rights Commission. Charlotte Ann, thank you for being here. How are you?
I'm doing well. Thanks so much for having me, Ray. Really appreciate it.
Thank you. Thank you. So you've stepped into your role at a time when issues like racism, reconciliation, and equity are front and center. What gives you hope right now and what still feels heavy?
Yeah, absolutely. So, look, the Canadian Human Rights Commission has a really big mandate. It's to protect and promote human rights in Canada. And we also have a really ambitious vision, right? It's an inclusive society where everyone is valued and respected and has access to equal opportunities free of discrimination. So I think you're absolutely right. Doing this work at this time has to mean addressing things like systemic racism, advancing reconciliation with Indigenous people, and achieving substantive equality for people across the country. And, when I think about the barriers and discrimination that people still feel in this country, it does feel heavy. And frankly, I think it should, because we have a really significant responsibility. And for me, that heaviness and the hope go hand in hand, right? I think we can recognize the weight of those responsibilities and still find hope. And in fact, I think we have to, if I think about like the fact of a human rights mechanism like ours existing, that alone gives me hope, our world right now, the global context of regression of rights, having a robust human rights institution that's actually equipped to translate these rights into meaningful remedies in the everyday, I think that's really meaningful. And, I find hope in the everyday of what I do. I find hope in our work in advocating and speaking out for human rights in Canada. I find hope in working with my colleagues across the Commission, many of whom actually have lived experience of the kind of discrimination we're looking to address. I find hope in working with my fellow commissioners, Pay Equity Commissioner, Accessibility Commissioner, the Federal Housing Advocate, to really look at addressing these systemic issues proactively. And I also find a lot of hope in the human rights complaints that come to us. And maybe I could just speak for a moment a bit about that, because I think it is really important. When I think about our role, and in maybe in particular my job in kind of in the job of chief commissioner, part of what I do is I review complaints that come to us. So I'm reading people's stories and I'm reviewing settlements. So how these cases have been resolved, what remedies the parties are able to get to. And that is so meaningful. I think it takes a lot of courage for people to come forward to talk about what is often the hardest thing that they're going through or have gone through. I also find hope when we have successes at mediation and conciliation, when the parties come together and listen to each other and find common ground, that there's a resolution that works for both parties, that there's an accountability for, what's gone on, and there's a path forward for people. So, whether it's something really individual, like maybe it's some money for the harm that was caused or lost wages. Sometimes it's really individual, but other times it's more about, or also about systemic resolutions. It's not just what happened to this person, but making sure it doesn't happen to others. So changing a policy or changing a practice. And I certainly find hope in that and in the people who trust us with their stories when they come forward and believe that they can access human rights justice.
Wow, thank you. I love what you said. You spoke about systemic resolutions. Many people feel like institutions say the right things, but don't always follow through. How can the commission stay grounded and real for communities that have been overlooked or let down?
Yeah, thank you so much for asking that, Ray. I think it's a really important question. And as the National Human Rights Institution for Canada, our role is a bit different than, say, civil society or advocacy groups. It's also separate from government. We're independent, from government, but we are empowered by a whole series of pieces of legislation that give us these tools to do our mandate, to promote and protect human rights, and to do that in both proactive and responsive ways. And I think that in all of that, like whatever hat it is we're wearing, it's so important to stay grounded, as you put it. And for me, what that means is staying true to our values and listening to communities. And I think the truth is that this organization, like many, as hard as we try to stay true to our values, there are people who have been let down. There are people who have been overlooked. And I think if we want to work effectively at advancing human rights in this country, we need the trust of the people we serve, right? Mm-hmm. And so I think it's really important that our work is informed by the experiences of those people and those communities. And then as a public institution, you know, we have a responsibility, I would say, to listen, to learn, and to act. And so when I think about, you know, the commission and its history and how we kind of contribute in that, I think about, you know, the issues that we hear from communities now. And it, you know, some of the things are the same issues, you know, but a lot of what we're talking about right now, they might not have been the issues that were top of mind when the government created the commission back in 1977, you know, with the creation of the Canadian Human Rights Act. And that's, I think, a big part of why we need to stay connected to advancing human rights in this moment and what it means to be relevant to communities in this moment. So I think about things in the history of the commission, you know, so for example, the commission advocated for the repeal of Section 67 of the Canadian Human Rights Act. And when that happened, it actually really expanded the availability of the federal human rights complaint system to new people, specifically to First Nations communities. You know, there have been other changes to the Canadian Human Rights Act over the years. So, for example, the addition of gender identity and expression as an official ground of discrimination within the Canadian Human Rights Act. You know, that specifically makes it illegal to discriminate against someone based on their identity. So those are examples of that evolution. And I think, you know, stakeholder engagement, talking to people who have lived experience, people who are human rights experts, that's how we continue to ensure that our work is actually achieving the outcomes we're seeking. You know, if I think about the conversations that I have had in this role and with many of my colleagues, you know, there's certain things that just come up again and again in those engagements, right? Like we hear about the importance of recognizing specific lived experience, especially of people facing intersectional forms of discrimination. So maybe we're talking about the experience of being both Black and living with a disability, or both Indigenous and being a woman, for example. And also the real importance of disaggregated data so that we actually have an accurate, complete, and rich picture of what is actually happening in this country right now, the discrimination that people face. And we can be accountable as we try to move the dials. So, you know, there's a lot of areas where I think, you know, we have opportunities to reflect what we learn in those engagements. And it's really, I think, our responsibility to use those opportunities. Like if I think about meeting with stakeholders and, you know, listening to community, we have pretty unique opportunities because of what we're empowered to do, to bring their voices into different spaces, to highlight their experiences. So whether that's through our public advocacy, maybe it's the advice we give to Parliament, even our engagement on, you know, the international human rights stage, and certainly, you know, when we're advancing cases before the tribunal and in the court. So that to me is all work that is necessarily informed by people with lived experience, both within the commission and across Canada, and needs to be. You know, if I think about the topics we've talked about publicly, you know, in the last year, I can think of the conversations that I've had with people that have motivated us speaking out on those issues. You know, the reports I've read, absolutely, you know, the documentaries, the books, all of that, but also the actual conversations, you know. So if we're talking out about, you know, whether it's hate crimes, anti-Semitism, Islamophobia, we're talking about, you know, the human rights of two-spirit, trans, gender diverse youth. We're talking about reform to the Employment Equity Act or the Canada Disability Benefit, like the creation of an Indigenous human rights mechanism. All of these kinds of pieces, I think, that are so key to moving the dial on human rights in this country, they come in our work from a deep engagement with community, and I think they have to. So honestly, I believe really deeply that to have the outcomes that we're looking for, which is, I think, meaningful progress on human rights, addressing historical wrongs, addressing ongoing systemic inequalities, keeping pace with evolving society and culture, that all of that necessarily means staying grounded in the lived experiences of diverse people across this country.
Okay. These days, people are speaking out more than ever but people are speaking more about, harmful speech that spreads really quickly. How do we strike the right balance between free expression and protecting people's dignity?
Yeah, so this is a really complex issue, and I'll try not to spend the hour I'm sure I could spend on it. Maybe what I can do is tell you just a little bit about kind of the Commission's history on this issue and where we stand. So at the Commission, we have some expertise on this issue because there used to be something known as Section 13 in the Canadian Human Rights Act, and it specifically allowed people to make a human rights complaint to the Commission if they encountered hate through a federally regulated entity. Now, when this was first envisioned, the world was pretty different. So we're talking about things like 1-800 numbers with neo-Nazi content. The internet came along, then we have everyone who is able to be their own broadcaster. And we have conversations like this today. Like, there's so much that we've gained from that democratizing of our media. And also there have been some really dangerous and harmful consequences of how all of that has evolved as well. And so, look, I don't think there's any secret Section 13 wasn't a sufficient way to address hate back in the day. We would be taking down one hateful website and then there's another, 2, 3, 4 just popping up. So I think with the current environment that we're in, conversations online have such a bigger platform. Technology is allowing hate to spread. I'm worried about AI and bots and the spread of hate in different and new ways. And I think it's a really big human rights issue. I want to be really clear. Hate has no place in our society. Hate shuts down human rights. It shuts down freedom to debate, to participate, to live free from fear. And I think that is really especially true for communities who might also be facing other forms of discrimination. So I think that we talked a bit about the need to stay grounded in the experiences of people. That's how we understand how it's actually manifesting in people's lives. I think part of your question is about the balance between free expression and protecting people's dignity. So maybe I can just speak for a moment about that. I think that whenever we're going to be talking about addressing hateful content, like, we're going to be talking about free expression. The Supreme Court of Canada has taken a pretty nuanced view on this, and I think it's helpful in that we learn from them that not all expression is created equal. I think another way to put that is freedom of expression is not a one-way street, and certainly hate does not have the right of way. So when people who seek to harm others, those people should not be able to use human rights protection to defend that behavior. And I think that's why we need a really comprehensive solution to the spread of misinformation, to the spread of hate in Canada. And especially as we look at what changes are on the horizon with AI and things like that, we just really need to make sure that we are thinking about it in a way that's grounded in how people experience this harm, and what systems are in place that might actually be facilitating it to some degree. So I do worry about, AI, for example, reproducing some of the risks of the worst of what's online, amplifying hate, reinforcing hateful stereotypes. So, there's lots of good on the horizon. I think accessibility, there's lots of good things we can think about, efficiencies from AI. But as we look at this environment, absolutely, I think it's really important that we have a comprehensive approach to hate speech that's really rooted in the experience of people and thinking about it as a human rights issue.
Okay. Charlotte Ann, across Canada, Black communities continue to face real barriers in housing,
Yeah.
employment, and justice. From where you sit, what needs to shift for meaningful progress, and how can the commission actually help drive that change?
Yeah. I think a lot needs to shift, and we have different roles to play. So I would say at a bigger level, I would say certainly deeper awareness and understanding is really important so that we
Hmm.
actually know what each other in other communities and other parts of the country are going through, have been going through, what the systemic injustices are, what historical wrongs have marked this country, but then also to translate that into action with accountability. So, I think, for example, of the UN decade for people of African descent. So there's
Yes.
now the second decade, Canada has co-sponsored it. What will that mean, right, in practice? I think it's a call to action for transformative change, for justice for Black communities, to address socioeconomic barriers, to your question around employment and housing. And so I think there is an opportunity to really be using that as a way to hold Canada accountable on this, and we have a role in that. So certainly in terms of our advocacy, but also in terms of complaints. When we think about moving the dial on these issues, I do think our complaints handling function. So when people come to us with a human rights complaint, um, there is such power, and that power is in the people who have bravely chosen to come forward, and they are using our system to affect change. A lot of that work happens behind closed doors because those processes are by default from the outset confidential, right?
Hmm.
So, a lot of those cases, the vast majority get resolved through settlements. Those are meaningful in people's everyday lives. But how we do that is also important, right? So having staff with diverse lived experiences, who are looking at these files, sometimes with their own lived experiences of something similar, who have also received, the right training to understand the trauma that attaches to a lot of the experiences that people are coming forward with. And then for us to continue to push the law forward. So we have a role not just in helping people use the law, but then also in our advocacy, advocating in the public interest before the tribunal and in the courts, and on, in public policy issues. So, you've talked about some key areas in housing, employment, and justice. I'm happy to talk a little bit more about that. Certainly, I see a big connection between the cost of living crisis and the experiences of Black communities in Canada, but also some of these issues come together in some really deeply rooted ways, like around environmental racism and the way that people, depending where they live in this country, have different health outcomes. So there's a lot there. Certainly
Hmm.
more we could talk about. Yeah.
Okay. Um, you know, Stories shape how we see each other. In
Yeah.
your view, how can storytelling through media, lived experience, as we spoke earlier, or education help move human rights forward in Canada?
So I think storytelling is transformative. Part of why I was excited to have this interview, to be honest, is because I've watched some of your interviews and I find it really
Thank you.
inspiring to hear about other people's experiences, and also just some of the stories they tell about what they've done, accomplished, overcome, whatever the case may be, their vision for what this country should be, for what their contribution to our communities is. So, I think stories are all around us. Certainly, in my role at the commission, the kinds of stories that I hear a lot in my day-to-day work are in the form of complaints that are coming to us. And
Yeah.
every person that comes to us, like, they are telling us the story of what they lived through. And I think that is such a responsibility, and also such a privilege. So, every day I am reading about what this country is really like. I'm reading about what's going on in workplaces and businesses across the country. It's eye-opening. I don't think I need to tell you we have a long way to go. But it is also what kind of fuels my passion for this work. And I know that's true of so many of my colleagues, right? Because when you listen to someone else's story, you hear each other more fully, you can empathize with each other more. And I think that's so key to moving the dial on human rights. So if you're interested, I can share with you some of the stories that have come through in complaints. A lot of it is confidential, but in some instances, the parties have let us share that. So maybe
Please
that would
do.
be helpful. Yeah. So yeah, as I mentioned, most of the complaints confidential in nature. So I can tell you that there are all kinds of experiences that people are coming forward, whether it's someone harassed them in the workplace,
Hmm.
used racist language to describe them, maybe, or they weren't accommodated during a job process. So, for example, they weren't allowed to use their hearing aid, and so they were disadvantaged, in the course of that, and as a result, suffered discrimination. We're receiving complaints from women who've been sexually assaulted in the Canadian Armed Forces. So those are some of the cases that are now coming to us. And those are, when I say that I feel a responsibility when we hear stories, I feel that to all cases. And certainly as we start to have those new responsibilities, even more so perhaps. And in all of those instances, the reason I give you those examples is in part because I think it takes these sort of legal protections. They're kind of abstract, and it grounds them in like every day. What might that look like? Translating them kind of into the everyday experience. And I think if we hear about the successes that people have, it actually, I hope, it helps empower people to know that they can come forward. And whether that's because, they want to file a complaint, provincially, federally, or whether they just want to address something that's going on around them. I also think there's a really big piece here about employers and service providers, right? So the storytelling isn't just for other people who have experienced discrimination. I think it's empowering to hear that. But a lot of people, they know the truth of their lives, what they walk around this world experiencing. It's so important for those of us who are employers or service providers that we are also responsive to that. So when I think about, some of the instances in which the parties have been willing to make their settlements public, part of why I find that so important is because it shines a light on what is possible, what remedies are possible in human rights complaints, and it shows other employers, other service providers, an example, right? And we've had a bunch of these. If I think about the last couple of years, well, I've been in the role, certainly, I mentioned earlier the Canadian Armed Forces. We had our first public settlement in that would experience sexual assault. That settlement had really significant pieces in it around safety, around healthcare measures and training from a preventative perspective. We also had a complaint of a Black cadet in the RCMP and some really significant, commitments in that settlement around addressing and preventing systemic discrimination, in the RCMP Training Academy. Another one that comes to mind with CSIS, it was a Black woman who worked as an intelligence officer. And that settlement, again, addressed systemic discrimination and specifically around, HR practices. So I think there's a lot of courage in coming forward, period. There's also an extra layer, if I can put it that way, of courage when people are willing to say what they're doing publicly, so what they've experienced or what they're willing to put on the table to resolve things. And I think that if we hear that, I hope, by hearing those stories, that's how movements begin and change
Yeah.
happens,
Yeah.
I think
It's
we
not easy.
that. Yeah.
It's not easy. I've heard a lot of people. I mean, I have personal stories, but obviously, it's not easy for people to step forward and say, okay, this is what I went through,
Yeah,
and I'm willing to step forward. So I agree with you when you say people are very courageous once they decide to make that step.
absolutely.
Hmm.
And that's then a responsibility, I would say, for us, right? And it's something I talk to my colleagues about. Like, imagine you filled out that form. Like, what would you like this process to look like for you? And we're not there
Mm.
yet. There's progress to be made, but there's also a lot of good work we've done. And I think in large part because we are, I think just as people affected by stories and should be, right? Like, I don't know, statistics, like I don't really remember them. Maybe some folks have more of a numbers brain, but I think of the stories that led to these big changes in Canadian society, whether it's things around, the disability rights movement, the civil rights movement, pride, all of those developments. Like, I think of the stories of the people who came forward. I'm sure you do too, as opposed to kind of the numbers or the dates or whatnot. So I think it's really important that we share stories, because I think that's what we remember, and it's how we empathize with each other.
Amazing. Listen, my last question for you, Charlotte Ann, is, I know, correct me if I'm wrong, I think you studied in international studies and music. Am I correct?
I did do some, yeah, yeah.
Is music still part of your life today?
It is maybe not in the ways it always was.
Okay.
But one of my great passions, and it's sort of different from all of this, but I think it's so related, is I'm from St. John's, Newfoundland, and
Yes.
I grew up playing fiddle. And, I find the ways that we express ourselves, like whether it's dance or theater or music, like that's kind of how we build community. And that was my experience growing up. So playing fiddle was a big part of being uh, in the community that I was in growing up. And it's a big part of how I manage some of the heaviness of this job also, is listening to some music, playing some music. So yes, definitely still a part of my life, and hopefully will be forever. Yeah.
Yes, that's the reason. That's exactly the reason I asked, because I know I had the honor of having Mohammed Hashim here, the Canadian Race Relations Foundation president and director, and I asked him the same questions. Can if I had the opportunity to speak like people like you in your position with a very heavy workload, I always ask the questions that, what do you do to recharge? Because every day is about complaints. I can understand how heavy that can be. So I know music is part of your life. So I was wondering, what if there a song, is there a group that you like to listen to that kind of brings back some peace after a long day?
Well, I'm going to share something that probably none of your listeners are familiar with, but maybe this will be my little bit of Newfoundland education. So, I grew up, as I said, in St. John's, and at a time, I think, where there was a bit of a revival of traditional music. So the people that I go, like, whose music I listen to, are the people whose recordings I grew up with, fiddle players like Emile Benoit, Rufus Ginchard. But if you want maybe something that's a little bit like, maybe more approachable, in the sense of a current recording that's a group on the go now, maybe a bit more accessible, definitely recommend listening to the Dardanelles. They've got one of the best voices out of the province and fiddle players, really fantastic. And for folks who might listen to Q on CBC, one of their members is Tom Power. So that's the right band if you find him in it.
Amazing. Thank you for the recommendation,
Absolutely.
Charlotte Ann. I thank you for your time. I like to end my conversations with this phrase: we learn today and we lead tomorrow.
Mm.
So thank you very much.
Thank you. I really appreciate it.
Thank you.